As you can probably already tell, Necrobarista looks amazing. From its brilliant art direction to having some of my favourite shots to come out of anything ever in its story, this game ticks all of my cinematography boxes. It's a good thing, it also has a brilliant story with lots of amazing themes, interesting characters, and my most listened to OST of 2021 to boot. The perspective of the player in Necrobarista is one that's difficult to easily explain. While they have next to no input in the visual novel sections of the game, in between all of those sections the player is allowed to walk around the coffee shop the game is set in, the terminal. I'm sure based on the first few moments players could think they're viewing the game from the perspective of Kashan, especially since they serve as a kind of audience surrogate for the first few chapters of the game. Combine this with how Kashan gets about as much screen time as the other big players in the story, and I'd say the game is viewed from a more traditional third-person perspective. The player doesn't actually have any kind of input on anything aside from how fast the game moves. Every dialogue box is shown by the click of a mouse, same with every cut to a different shot, and other than that, the player is just kind of a spectre walking around the coffee shop between chapters. In these sections between chapters, you can interact with certain items like the game's bonus features, or these items that tell stories about the world and characters that were never animated. They give a lot of cool scenes where the characters are in environments we never see them in, probably due to the limitations of the game, where we only really see the most important scenes for characters, nothing in between. Another likely symptom of these limitations though is that the game is very short and it feels like there's a lot of scenes missing. The game's plot feels like it's been sanded down to its key points. In my opinion, the game's story is still phenomenally told, aside from some pacing issues, and to be fair, it wouldn't really surprise me if some people were to say they lost investment towards the middle when the plot becomes more high stakes, quite jarringly. It's definitely a game that if you're not on board with almost right from the outset, you're not really going to enjoy all of it. I still think though, if you're someone who wants to know how to make a shorter story captivating, you should look into Necrobarista. The way it's able to make you care about Maddie and Kashan in particular from really early on is great. Their flaws were apparent enough, but they're still captivating characters with well-written dialogue. Even though Kashan is dealing with a situation most players will never relate to, he does so in a natural and understandable way that makes you invested in him. His vent in Chapter 4 to Maddie and Ned in particular made me really feel for him. I think the only exception to the full-out captivating writing is Ned and Ashley, who both have comparatively limited screen time, lacking in exposition and detail about their characters. I'd say they're two sides of the same coin. Ned is an example of where this writing helps mystify him. Ned worked for a mystical, unknown and unelaborated on council. He also has this outlandish design with some human enough features, but it's still very inhuman and uncanny. Combine this with how he's written with hundreds of years in his past, and it creates my personal favourite character in the game. Although I do go back and forth on him and Maddie as to my favourite, so we'll see how long that opinion sticks. This has the opposite effect with Ashley, who because of her extremely limited screen time relative to Maddie and Kashan, I personally found more annoying than anything. Apart from one or two more serious scenes, the first of which does kind of come out of nowhere and feel a bit forced, Ashley never breaks apart from being such a dramatically obsessed caffeine addict with violent overreactions. And I think she's the character that would have benefited the most from just a bit more screen time. This isn't a jab at Ashley, she's great in what she's first introduced as, comic relief. Given all of the other characters' much more serious interactions, the game wouldn't be as good without these breaks that she causes. My only issue is that she isn't developed enough to make her serious scenes as brilliant as Maddie's or Che's or Kashan's, but she is still a brilliant character. The game also kind of rushes to its conclusion, and it feels like you've skipped a lot through the game if you didn't read everything that you could. Like, the big conflict, the big scene in the game, the most important scene in the game, happens at a point where it feels like it could have been the first bits of many conflict. Talking about that brings me just a few other complaints though. I know I've been negative in this video, but just stick with me. This game is really fucking good, I swear. I'm just getting all these nitpicks out of the way. There's only a few more of them. Necrobarista has all the foundations to make one of my favourite gaming experiences. Right up there with Firewatch, Edith Finch and Presentable Liberty, just to name a few. Which, trust me when I say, is incredibly high praise. Unfortunately, despite this phenomenal direction, it's at best masterful and at worst middling writing, I'd say that the game could have done with voice acting. The big conflict of the game is where Maddie and Ashley try to perform necromancy and it fails. The visual direction and music are all fantastic, but because you'll just read the text the same way you do everything else, it kind of kills the tension. I think the biggest issue is caused by the fact that the player controls the speed the game moves at. If I just want to pause on a scene or a shot for a while, it will just pause. If you stumble over your words when reading, it's fine, the text is always going to be there. I think a solution here without voice acting would be the game would actually move the dialogue forward on its own if you take longer than a few seconds, or even less in more tense scenes. Doing this, I think, would more accurately reflect the tension of the scene itself. Think of the way Deltarune or the DS Pokemon games handle it, where the character's text moves faster and skips on its own to show a character talking quickly. And to be fair, the game does already do this to a degree. Text either appears letter by letter in normal conversation, but to reflect the tone of characters, the text can appear sentence by sentence to add a level of urgency. But I think taking this choice a bit further, exclusively in the tenser scenes, would take this game from a 9 to a 10. But again, this is mostly a nitpick. And my final issue, which again is more like a nitpick, are these 3 robots. At the end of every single chapter, these robots will burn with their opinions, and also some in-universe and fourth-wall breaking comedy. It was initially pretty interesting and a good way to give another source of exposition to these characters. Since they were made by Ashley, I thought they would say a lot more about her, but I eventually just started skipping these scenes because they boiled down to a rather pointless banter between the robots, and I would much rather skip this and go to the next part of the story which I was really caring about. The worst example of this is just after the necromancy scene, where they just kind of go, yikes, that was pretty tense, huh, and then just continue joking. And then, as the game slowly winds down and gets really emotional, showing all these characters going through the most emotional parts of their stories, which is phenomenal by the way, they keep showing up! You become really invested in this emotional story and they keep getting in the way. But even so, their scenes are never too long, so if you don't like them you can just spam click or spam spacebar through them pretty easily. It's no big deal, again, a nitpick. Anyway, now my complaints are out the way, let's talk some more about this brilliant writing and fantastic direction. To start, the dialogue in this game is framed especially well. I really like how some words are highlighted in orange. It makes the words more important and stand out. It happens when Maddie mentions killing with Ned, a word that would have gone over my head if not for this highlighting, to add that additional bit of weight. Typically, it's used to highlight an important word in a current conversation, although it is just sometimes used for a word that's not too often used or would stand out in a sentence, like Maddie's nickname for Kashat at the end of chapter 1. It's just an interesting visual flair, which is something that this game excels at. The game also uses the fact of kind of moving text a lot. Animation on the characters is very limited, I assume because of the budget, but honestly I'd say it works in the game's favour. It makes the times animation is used on the characters feel much more impactful and important. They use this to absolutely fantastic effect in both of the game's side stories. One of my favourite touches is how the end of a character's sentence is sometimes used to transition between scenes. I know that this stuff doesn't necessarily make a game, but it all adds up phenomenally and also could add a ton of weight, especially in crucial moments. Anyway, let's finally get to the story I keep raving about but not directly talking about. Necrobarista's story revolves around this cafe called The Terminal, a cafe that exists between life and death. Visitors get to stay there for 24 hours before they have to move on to the next place, presumably the actual afterlife. The cafe is run by Che and Maddie, Che being the older, more experienced one who only very recently made Maddie the manager and owner of the cafe. Kishan is someone who recently died. He visits the cafe and his arrival gives Maddie and Che all the excuse they need to give Kishan and by extension the audience all the exposition they need, and all that I already mentioned. The game's focus is mainly on the dynamics between these characters. I'd say the most important is Maddie and Che, because they both have a hard time throwing out customers who stay far longer than they should. The cafe is in debt to the Council of Death. The Council of Death are this never elaborated on mysterious group behind the scenes of everything, and they sent Ned to go remind them of that debt, as well as a few other things. The first few chapters revolve around Kishan being explained the world the game is set in, alluding to the motivations of the Council of Death, establishing Ned's history with Che, but also showing the means Maddie is considering to pay off their debt, but also some other things that Maddie is planning behind the scenes. The game then really jumps off from there, using Kishan's lack of understanding as a way to give exposition on the Council, using Ashley as an excuse to make coffee jokes, and diving deeper into Che and Maddie's dynamic. This is where I'll stop with the spoilers though, since I really like it if you played this game. Trust me when I say I was fully invested and on board by the end, and if any of this seems interesting to you, you should really play it, despite all of my criticisms. Just a final few compliments before I wrap up. The game's art design is fantastic. The environments are detailed and lovely to look at, character designs are interesting and stand out without being too cluttered and over-designed. It's all really well designed and brilliantly polished. Another thing is the music. It's a tiny bit over the top at some points, but that's only really one or two select songs. The rest are phenomenal. Sunrise and Limbo was my most listened to song of 2021 according to Spotify. but that was mostly because I was falling asleep to it, so take that as you will. And recently, in a more recent update, are a few side stories too, in fact. They're just like those extra scenes that are just text, except these ones are fully animated, and they're like the rest of the game, which is super cool. I really like it. These ones do a lot with direction in particular that the main game doesn't, so they really ticked that box for me, and are probably the biggest tipping point as to why I made this video over covering something else. Another brilliant feature is the game studio mode, so you can use dev tools to create your own scenes. It's really intuitive and really fun, and you can create some great stuff using it. I made this video's thumbnail using it. In summary, Necrobarista is one of the best visual novels I've ever played. It makes phenomenal use of its 3D environments and dynamic camera. When it does well, it does phenomenally, and if you like what you see, I really recommend this game. It does have a slightly large price tag though, so if you'd rather wait for a sale, I can't blame you. As much as this game does have flaws, it makes up for them at every single turn, and I cannot wait to see what gets made next by these people. They've clearly got an extreme talent for writing and amazing visuals, and I'd love to see them get the budget they need to create an absolute masterpiece. And trust me, when it comes out, you'll be hearing all about it from me.